This is Dr. Rob Harder with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show as together we hear how they are making their world better. Welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. It's been so fun hearing from some of you recently, particularly those who've been reaching out and asking for coaching help. I've had several clients now, and as I'm going through and hearing what these issues are that each one of you are dealing with when it comes to leadership challenges, specifically in your role as a nonprofit leader, it makes me more committed than ever to coming alongside each one of you, because here's the bottom line, and you know this, right? Nonprofit leadership is not easy. Leadership is not easy, period. But nonprofit leadership, it's not for the faint of heart. And what I'm finding and what I'm hearing as I'm working with many clients now is just some of these issues that continue to come up really can be difficult. And if you can't find a way through them, that can often just take your joy out of leading. And as I've talked about in a previous podcast, more and more of you are thinking about leaving the nonprofit sector altogether because the pressures are so high or the support is not there. And so my encouragement to you is if you're listening to this podcast and you really enjoy this podcast, but maybe you're facing a challenge of your own and you just don't seem to be able to get over that challenge, or there's just so many challenges, you don't know which one to tackle, I encourage you to reach out. We'd love to consider figuring out how can we provide some coaching for you to help you get around those barriers, to overcome some of those challenges. So you can just reach out to me through email, rob@robharder.com. Again, rob@robharder.com. Would love just to hear more about your story and what you're struggling with, what you're dealing with. And my hope is, again, that we can help you move through to get to new levels of leadership. And really, that's the topic of today's show. It's all about leadership. Well, my guest today is Brenda Jimenez. She is the CEO of Mentor New York. Mentor New York is a nonprofit organization really dedicated to closing the gap, the mentoring gap within the state of New York. They do that by really being dedicated to ensuring that young people have mentoring opportunities wherever they live. So as Brenda and I have a conversation today, we'll talk about all kinds of leadership challenges, but specifically those facing the nonprofit sector. And what is it? What are those traits that are most important for nonprofit leadership? And then I ask her, who are the people in her own life that really shaped her own leadership to the point where it's made her the leader that she is today? Well, as always, love having you tuning in. Now on to the show. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Well, welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I have Brenda Jimenez on the show today. So excited to have Brenda with us. She is the leader of Mentor New York, and she's going to tell us all about her experience and what they're facing right now. So Brenda, thanks first of all for taking time out to be on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, you are the CEO of Mentor New York, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated really to closing that mentoring gap in New York State. Maybe just to begin, talk a bit about what all that Mentor New York does.
Yeah, sure. So Mentor New York is actually an affiliate to a national organization called Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. And what the national organization does is actually collects all the research and evidence-based data around young people and the impacts that mentoring has on their life. And one of the things that we know from the research is that 1 in 3 individuals during their young life grow up without a mentor. And so when we think about that, we are trying to make sure when we talk about that mentoring gap, that that's not a consistent reality from generation to generation, right? And that every young person, wherever they live, learn, work, and play in New York State actually has a mentor. And so through the research and evidence-based practices, local affiliates like myself actually help organizations, community leaders, youth development, after-school programs, nonprofits, infuse mentoring into their practices or develop mentoring programs so that young people could have those very meaningful, intentional mentoring relationships that allow for impacts in their lives, positive impacts. We know that mentoring is a great way to ensure that young people go to school, that they actually graduate, that they explore careers, that they limit risky behaviors, combat loneliness and mental health issues that they might be facing because they have a caring adult that's actually supporting.
Well, your commitment to women's and children's issues certainly has motivated you to serve the community in this way. What stands out in your own leadership training as to what best prepared you for what you're doing now? Did you receive mentoring yourself? Was it your education? Was it a combination of several things? Tell us a little bit more about your story and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things, right? So, what I will tell you is my mom was in the corporate world and banking. And sometimes, as a manager, she would come home and start to explain to me sort of the challenges with managing and running an organization, right? And the constructs of running a team. And so, I was always the thought partner and the advisor, which was an easy lane to develop over time. And then there's the personal sort of mission based motivation that you have for helping others. I know that, for me, it's been very impactful throughout my young life to see women who were strong and thriving and facing different challenges in community and really understanding the complexities of, how hard it is to balance it all. So you start to really appreciate the supports that people need to thrive. I had a wonderful high school history teacher who taught me how to become a political junkie and learn all about history. And so he really encouraged me to go to the school I wanted to go to. That's how I ended up in Seton Hall and university. And then I started to think about a job. And I remember thinking, I don't want to do anything where I have to sell something. And then I went to raise money for a nonprofit, right? The ultimate sell of all
Yeah,
sells.
right. Exactly.
But what I learned while I was raising money in a local United Way in Newark, New Jersey was as we were giving out grants and raising dollars, how important the business of service was in order for service to be sustainable and impactful in community, and that there were gaps in that, and that young people and women were vulnerable to those gaps of service at a greater rate than anyone else, right? And so that really prompted me to get focused around what nonprofit leadership looked like. How does the business of nonprofit management really run so that you can have sustainable impact and do good? And then that led me to my master's degree in public administration and nonprofit management. And always in the work. And I usually lived in the lane of advising the strategy to having the solutions, right? And I had some great mentors along the way because people who do that by and far have a for profit backgrounds. Usually, the folks in the nonprofit field are the ones doing the really challenging human work, right? That has an expertise. But you can't do the human work and balance the construct of the business simultaneously. There has to be something that propels the work forward, right? And so I found myself often talking to leaders who were really passionate about the human element of resolving the issues and not paying attention to the constructs that would help them do that. And so I spent a lot of time working with really smart leaders in the for profit space and nonprofit space who had learned and figured it out, who guided and mentored me. And then after a while, when you're in these different organizations advising, you realize that people only listen to half the stuff you tell them to do. And the hard stuff is really hard to do. And so that led me into becoming the chief operating officer of Mentor New York. And then that opened up space to become the CEO. So it's been a life journey of a lot of people influencing the way that I see the world, think about the world, and then seeing in real time the impact it has on individuals and how to be of service. So it's not a straight line, but it's a lot of mentors along the way for sure.
Now, well, thanks for sharing a bit of your journey. I love hearing personal stories and where you get to how you get to where you are today. Well, this podcast is all about leadership. So, as you think about your own experience, as you think about the leaders that you respect and look up to, What, in your opinion, are the most important traits of leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'm actually getting my doctorate in executive leadership.
Oh,
And this
congrats. Okay, way to go.
journey, yeah, so this journey really has taught me to put a lot of language behind things that I think sometimes leaders take for granted as being sort of a natural occurrence, but it's a lot more intentional and more formulaic than we would like to give it credit, right? And familiar, right? Leadership has ebbs and flows that are universal and familiar regardless of gender, race, language, location, right? But what I would say I've learned over time that's super important for leaders to learn early on is you have to get to know yourself. You have to know the good and the bad of you, right? Because when you are authentically honest with yourself, then you can really be empathetic, a great listener, and a driver of vision, which I think are the three salient things that executive leaders have to be good at doing, right? And so the empathy comes in the ability to be able to not only have compassion, but to be able to see the world out of different lenses. And that's a valuable part of the work, right? Especially the nonprofit work, because solutions don't come from a place of, because I think it's a great idea, or why wouldn't we do this? It's got to be an informed decision. And empathy allows you to be able to look at things from different lenses and understand where it's coming from so that you could ground your decision making and your thinking in a more, meaningful way, right? And then the active listening. Listen, I know people say they listen. No, they don't. Sometimes your staff is saying something, your clients are saying something, and you're seeing past it, either because you're caught up in the fact that you know, or you hope you know more than others, or you get caught up in the fact that it should look a certain way, it should be prescribed a certain way. And so then you get stuck. The active listening, right, with the level of empathy combined and knowing yourself and what your blind spots are, allows you to listen to the things that people aren't even saying sometimes. It makes you probe a little bit further. It allows you to, if you're doing it correctly, be a curious learner. Did I hear this correctly? What do you mean by that? So you're always dissecting what it is that you're receiving to make sure that there's no misunderstanding, right? Because then when there are misunderstandings, you actually can't innovate the way you would like to or make sound decisions. And then I would say the third thing is to be the steward of a vision, right? But I really have a unique way of seeing that. And I usually reference creating a snowman. The leader's on top of a mountain with a lot of snow, and you want to create a snowman, and it's got to have, the first big piece of snowball, the second for the body, the little one that's a little smaller for the head. And you're going to roll it down the hill, right? In the hopes that your staff packs it up. So when it gets to the bottom, you've got a good foundation for that snowman. But you start with the snowball on the top of the hill. It's not going to look the same on the bottom if you want to accomplish your vision, right? And I think a lot of times as leaders, that letting go process, that evolution, that allowing your staff to bring in input, to really listen so that that foundation of the snowman actually manifests itself down the hill, right? Needs to be in place. And a lot of times I find that visionaries get stuck on the vision and don't understand that conceptually it has to be part of this iterative process. And it actually becomes bigger, more powerful, more impactful than what you ever imagined it to be if you allow the strategy to play itself out, right? With all the talents at the table. So I would say those are the small things, right? It's life's work. It's life's work to get there, right? And a lot of trial and error as a leader as you go through it. But the more clear you are of who you are, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what the nuances of things that get in your way as a leader, you don't have to be honest with anybody else. Just be honest with yourself. it allows you to then show up with the empathy, active listening, and vision strategy that you need to really move the trajectory of impact, which is the work we do in the sector, right?
I like the idea of stewarding a vision, like how important that is, and good analogy with the snowman and coming down the hill with it. And yeah, I think that's so important. And particularly if you were serving as an executive director, CEO, you're the head of the organization, or even just the head of a department. I mean, it's really critical that you do steward that, own that, and do everything you can to really cast that vision well, clearly communicate. So let's go into that. When it comes to the various challenges that nonprofit leaders do face, there are a lot, I feel like, that are facing our world, and even more so all the time. And I think, since post COVID, I think the issues, what I found is that they're coming at us quicker. The changes are coming at us quicker. Everything from AI and how quickly that's changing the game in every sector, not just the nonprofit sector, but every sector. But what would you say some of the big issues and challenges facing the world and how they're impacting nonprofits? How then should nonprofit leaders change or adapt in light of these challenges as they lead their organizations?
Yeah, it's a tremendous question. And I say it's tremendous because I think about before COVID, we were at a point in the organization where we were trying to figure out how do we do statewide service. And I was just getting on board with GoToMeeting and doing webinars. And we could do this webinar virtual thing and scale it and have savings. And there was resistance everywhere in 2019, if you could imagine, before COVID, for this thing to happen. And we went into a strategic plan, and my strategic foresight with the board guiding that vision was, if we were going to scale this work, a virtual component, both by conference, teleconference, and webinar meetings, was going to have to exist. And we were investing in that infrastructure. Strategic foresight is so important in the marketplace because COVID hits. And guess who was so primed to do the work immediately on the ground? My team. We had been training on how to curate data, the webinar series, how we were going to do it. So for us, it became a turnkey reality that actually allowed us to be in the forefront of a lot of the solutions during COVID for young people, for the mentoring movement, and the funding came. What I will tell you is the hardest thing I am faced with right now is that the marketplace just will never be that slow moving again to be the predictor, right? That resistance level is now amplified and so quickly, and people's human behavior has changed, right? People don't gather the same way. They don't want to meet you, for the rubber chicken meal of a gala at 6 o'clock. They've got things to do, people to be in relationship with. I think we learned a big lesson during COVID that what was meaningful and closest to us had to stay close beyond that. And that behavior is not changing. And so now the sector has to think about, nonprofit leaders have to think about, what do fundraising events look like? What do gatherings look like? Because people are going to convene very differently under very different orders. And we're fighting that. We're resisting it. We're still doing the galas. I'm guilty of it too. I have one June 26th. I'm still trying to do the reception, right? Against the face of changed behavior. So I think one of the things that we really have to start doing as leaders is looking at the marketplace and knowing that we're not going to be able to predict it, that behaviors have changed, and that funding as a construct has also changed. And what does that mean for the sustainability of the organization? I think for a long time, people saw a crisis, they threw money at it, they were responsive to it. I don't think that's the same anymore. And it's really going to force us to think about these things very differently. So I would say the big shift is the marketplace. And I often tell my team, what's the responsive solution for this moment? With all the resources and the knowledge we know, what can we be responsive to right now with whatever trend we see. And I think that that's going to make organizations become more agile, more responsive, be more immediate. But it does put a different muscle into play for staff and executives who are used to just doing the work.
We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is donorbox.org. Are you ready to revolutionize your advocacy efforts and significantly impact policy change? Discover Quorum and level up your advocacy to better educate more lawmakers. Quorum is the only unified public affairs platform that empowers nonprofits to map, track, change, and report on the policy landscape, all in one place. Explore how Quorum Grassroots helps nonprofits create compelling campaigns in minutes. The result? Your nonprofit doesn't just participate in the advocacy, it drives it. Quorum, where influence meets innovation. You can learn more at quorum.us. Hey friends, and thanks so much for listening to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I want to let you know that I've recently become a professional certified coach. With my nearly 30 years of nonprofit experience, I know firsthand how hard you work as a leader. I also know how important it is to have someone you can call on to get help with the barriers, the leadership challenges that you will face both professionally and personally. And I really want people to thrive, to become all they were meant to become by providing coaching and consulting services. So if coaching is something you've always been interested in, but maybe weren't quite sure what it was all about, I encourage you to reach out. You can go to my website, robharder.com, or just email me at rob@robharder.com. I would happy to provide a free sample coaching session so you can determine if coaching is for you. All right, thanks again for tuning in. Now back to the show. Yeah, no, well said. And I think as I hear you talk and you shared a bit about how you got to where you are today, I always like asking the question of who are the most influential leaders in your own life, how they shaped you and how did they most impact you? So I was curious if you had one or two people that really stand out as the people that really shaped your own leadership and informed how you lead today.
So I would have to say that watching my mom lead, when I was young and managing an international, staff and department, and the level of pragmatic solution strategies she would put into play in complex systems. I always thought it can't be that simplistic, right? When we would talk about things. But that's always stayed very close to me, that those pragmatic solutions that are responsive always are most relatable, most at times impactful. And doing those small pragmatic things actually start to create opportunities to get into the more complex issues that you're grappling with. So I would say it would be my mom.
I like that. Your mom. That's great.
Yeah, no, it's the best business lessons, right, that I learned. And then later in life, I had this one mentor. She was my boss, who has since passed, Sylvia Farrell Jones. And I am a very, if you can imagine, kind of like Puerto Rican, rambunctious, personality. I walk in the room, I came into the room. And definitely when I was younger, I was about being seen and heard. And here was this, Yale Law School graduate lawyer who had all this experience, who did things very calculatingly quiet and observantly. And it always drove me crazy because she was the smartest person in the room, but she was very sort of precise with how she showed up and how she did things. And over the years, as I become more mature, I definitely have an appreciation of how she would show up into those spaces that way, and often find myself thinking, oh, now I understand that quiet strategy. And it didn't mean that in the end of it, it was quiet. Actually, she accomplished very big things and was very rambunctious and boisterous about it at some juncture. But it was the calculation of the when and the how and the timing. And so that was also a huge lesson for me, right? The being pragmatic, the knowing the timing of when you're going to be heard and when solutions best kick into.
That's good. No, I like that. I think it's an excellent insight. And kind of moving on into that, I'm a big believer in the principle that if you want to change the impact of a nonprofit, you really start with improving the leadership of that nonprofit. And oftentimes that's the executive director, it's the board, it's the key executive team. So, how best can leaders change in ways that really can move the needle and how they lead their organization? How would you answer that one?
I often think that people think that it's a person that's the problem, right? And sometimes we forget that the construct might not be healthy for anyone to actually thrive. I have found that everyone has talent. It's the responsibility of the leaders in the table to want to tap into that talent and to see it. Many times we tell our mentors the biggest power they have with their mentees is to see them, to be seen, not the way you want to see them, but who they are authentically. And so I would say that's one of the biggest things that I've learned over time. The strength of my executive team lies in the fact that they have many talents and that I'm tapped into what they aspire to learn and be a part of and do, and balance that against what it is that we must do in order to accomplish things. And when I give them the room to be able to grow within those realities, what I also do is give myself the room to tap into things that I don't even imagine for the organization as a whole. And so it takes more effort because you're in communication more. You are definitely on listen mode a lot more, but it allows you to identify root causes very differently, but start to address them. Not as a symptom, right? But like say, all right, we're going to do this part of a strategy, not because it's going to solve it, but because it'll get us closer to the bigger solution in the long term. But if you do that multiple times with different people in the stratosphere of leadership, you're going to get to a much bigger solution than the one you imagined. So sometimes when people say, I don't have the right board in place, sometimes I wonder, is it that you don't have the right board in place or you're not tapping into the essence of what that board can do for you, because there's some clarity and they understand how to tap their talents to your requests. And sometimes you have to connect the dots for people, right? I often say, I walk into places and I tell people it's an open book test. Like there is no surprises here. I need to know what you know. I'm going to share with you what I know. And then somehow in the middle, we're going to meet and we get to determine what the answer is, right? And I think a lot of times people show up feeling like they have to do a thing, whatever that thing is, and can't find the connectivity between that thing and who they are and what they could bring to the table. So I would say that's a key part of it. It's, being able to say, here's what my talents are. What are the talents in the room? How do you tap into it? And then listen, it's not absent of tough decisions. Sometimes you just have the wrong talents in the room. It's not a disparaging reality to that person. It's just not what you need in the organization. But you as a leader have to be able to also identify those things.
Okay. Well, one of the questions I like to ask my guests, and I haven't asked this for a while with my guests, but I thought a lot of the work you do so important, first of all, and I know you have a big impact in this organization in the city of New York and really the state of New York. So here's my question. What has given you hope today as you look into the future of our world, number one, the future of the nonprofit sector specifically, and really in the area of leadership? What has given you hope today?
So I would say two things. So I've been in the sector for 25 years and it used to drive me crazy when people came off the street and thought they could be a nonprofit manager, right? Like, oh, that's a throwaway job, right? I think the last two generations, especially my generation, the one coming, have really professionalized this sector. Human challenges are complex. They're not easy solutions. They need smart people around the table having really intelligent conversations and thinking of innovations and solutions. And the bottom line to those solutions and innovations is not necessarily a dollar. It is really humanity, right? At its best, both in performance and impact. So I would say the thing I'm most proudest of is that the sector has moved to understand that you can't talk about trauma-informed, services without people who understand what being trauma-informed is about and understand how to apply those things. So the professionalizing of the sector is a really important part. And would say the second thing is just young people in our country. I think we work on behalf of young people. We elevate youth voices across the state. And I'm always amazed that all the the stereotypes we have on young people are always incorrect, right? Yes, social media is not good. Yes, they can lift their heads up and be away from the phone. All of that is true. But when they do, our young people are pretty brilliant, right? And I think we miss out on that sometimes because we're caught up on all the bad that's going on. But I encourage anyone, take the time to get to know a young person, anywhere between the ages of 7 to 24. And there won't be a moment you say, was I doing that at that age? Or was I thinking that way? The complexities of the way they think, how they can operate things, move things, connect the dots is very different. And I think we underestimate those realities because we minimize them into the simplistic things we wish they would do or should know when they know so much more. So those are the things that give me great hope because within that, I know it's going to be great leadership that's emerging in so many ways.
Now, thanks for sharing that. And, for my listeners, or if people want to find out a little bit more about you, find out more about Mentor New York, where would you send them?
Yeah, www.mentornewyork.org.
Okay. Well, Brenda, thanks so much for sharing your insights today, being on the show, and just saying thanks for what you're doing. You've got a lot of experience. You just shared over 25 years worth. And I think the way you approach this leadership task that you have, as well as just what you do in your day in and day out work is just so inspiring. So thanks for all you're doing. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thank you for the time. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for being on the show. Hey, friends. Well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening. And until next time, keep making your world better. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Go to YouTube and look up Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. We'll see you there. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.